Have you ever wondered what will happen to you if you get caught violating an FAR? If so, you'll want to stick around to hear aviation lawyer Mark Kolber talk about the FAA's compliance program and what you should do if you find yourself in trouble with the FAA. And speaking of being in trouble, I recently heard an aircraft being intercepted on 121.5, the emergency frequency, and I was able to record it. And I'll play that for you after the news. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. Last week in episode 331, we talked with Jason Blair about recent changes for FAA check rides and aviation testing standards. And we talked with him again later in the week in episode 332 about how the new FAA Authorization Act will affect flight training and DPEs or pilot examiners. So if you didn't hear those episodes, you may want to check them out at aviationnewstalk.com/331 and /332. And if you're new to this show, welcome. I'm glad that you found us. Now, if you would take a moment and touch either the subscribe key or if you're using the Apple Podcast app, the follow key so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And this is a listener-supported show, and I'll tell you more about that later. Coming up on the news for the week of June 3rd, 2024, an Apollo 8 astronaut has died in a plane crash. 4 different pilots in different incidents are being charged with crimes here in the U.S. An eVTOL air taxi service may start up next year, and we'll tell you where. All this and more, and the news starts now. From Fox13Seattle.com, William Anders, Apollo 8 astronaut, was killed in the San Juan Islands plane crash. Retired astronaut William Anders, who was a member of the Apollo 8 crew, was killed in a crash off the San Juan Islands on Friday. The U.S. Coast Guard said the crash happened near Orcas Island before 11:45 a.m. The plane, which was owned by Anders, was a Beechcraft T-34 Mentor, a single-engine piston military trainer used by the U.S. Air Force and Navy for several decades. The model was in production from 1953 to 1990, and over 2,300 of them were built. Anders, who was 90 years old, was a member of the Apollo 8 crew. According to NASA, the mission was also famous for the iconic Earthrise image snapped by Anders, which would give humankind a new perspective of the home planet. Anders has said that despite all the training and preparation for an exploration of the moon, the astronauts ended up discovering Earth. In 1988, Anders retired from the U.S. Air Force Reserve and became the chairman and CEO of General Dynamics Corporation in 1991. 2 years later, he retired and stayed on as chairman until 1994. Now, I've watched a video that was shot by a bystander, and it appears that Anders was performing aerobatics, but didn't pull out of a maneuver in time before hitting the water. On aviation-safety.net, it says, quote, "The video shows the aircraft in an inverted dive/loop before it impacted the water at high speed. It appears that the maneuver is consistent with a split S, in which the pilot half rolls their aircraft inverted and executes a descending half loop, resulting in level flight in the opposite direction at a lower altitude." From 6abc.com, distractions, multitasking, miscommunication led to 2023 near collision at JFK. Interruptions, distractions, and multitasking led to a near collision between an American Airlines flight and a Delta flight moving at 120 miles per hour down the runway at JFK last year. Controllers cleared a Delta 737 for takeoff on runway 4 left. However, 20 seconds after the aircraft began its takeoff, an American Airlines B777 destined for London crossed the same runway without a clearance. NTSB investigators said numerous factors contributed to the American Airlines captain's mistake, including, quote, "interruptions and multitasking that were happening on the flight deck during critical moments of ground navigation." The other 2 flight crew members didn't catch the captain's error because they were both engaged in tasks that diverted their visual attention from outside the aircraft. Additionally, investigators said the ground controller, who provided taxi instructions, didn't notice the aircraft turned onto the wrong taxiway because he was performing a lesser priority task that involved looking down. The probe found that when the Delta flight accelerated down the runway, JFK's Surface Detection Equipment, or ASDX, issued oral and visual alerts in the air traffic control tower. 5 seconds after the alerts were issued, the controller canceled the Delta plane's takeoff, which prompted its pilot to decelerate as the American jet crossed in front of it. The NTSB has pushed for ASDX to be installed at airports since 1991. JFK installed theirs in 2009 and is just one of 35 major airports to have it. NTSB Chairman Jennifer Hamady said, quote, "Our investigation also makes clear that we've long supported systems that warn flight crews of risks directly because every second matters." The agency has issued several recommendations in light of the incident, including encouraging flight crews to verbalize the number of the runway they are about to cross and pushing aircraft and avionics manufacturers to develop an improved system that would alert flight crews of traffic on runways. Additionally, the NTSB called on the FAA to require all planes to be fitted with cockpit voice recorders that record 25 hours of audio. The American's flight recordings were lost in this case because the plane continued to London and the data was overwritten. From boldmethod.com, loose iPad jams pilot's trim wheel leading to an emergency landing. Now, this comes from a NASA ASRS report written by a flight crew that was flying a light corporate jet, and it details a jammed trim wheel leading to an emergency landing. Quote, "Upon descent between 4,000 and 10,000 feet, an annunciation master caution illuminated with AP mistrim illuminated. After the master caution switch was pressed, the annunciation extinguished shortly thereafter. The captain, who was the flying pilot, pressed and held down the autopilot disconnect button, disconnecting the autopilot. He then tried to manually trim the aircraft, and the elevator trim wheel was jammed and would not move. At this point, he asked me, the first officer, the pilot monitoring, to declare an emergency and request ground equipment to stand by. He then instructed me to run the checklist. I proceeded to run the checklist for both AP mistrim annunciation and then trim controls jammed. The captain landed the aircraft safely and we taxied to the FBO. After deplaning the aircraft, the captain went back in the aircraft to troubleshoot the problem with the power on. First with the electronics trim, then manually. Upon doing so, the captain noticed something was moving underneath the trim wheel. During the descent, an iPad got lodged underneath the trim wheel and jammed the trim wheel. To prevent this from happening in the future, I suggest having the pilot's side pockets be utilized for iPads and the pilot's rear pockets used for the checklist. This would prevent an iPad from sliding underneath the trim wheel and jamming the trim controls." From generalaviationnews.com, flight to drop candy ends in crash. The Cessna 172 was flying over a camp near Brevard, North Carolina, so that a passenger could drop candy from the airplane. The pilot told investigators that the airplane was a couple hundred feet above the trees in slow flight. The next thing he remembered was waking up in a hospital. According to one of the passengers, after the candy drop, the airplane flew around the camp so that photographs could be taken. The passenger told investigators that the airplane was descending, so he made a comment to the pilot about getting close to the treetops and needing to apply power and pull up. The pilot said something similar to, "I'm working on it." The passenger recalled that the airplane hit some trees and that he woke up next to the airplane on the ground. He and the other passenger, as well as the pilot, sustained serious injuries in the crash. A GoPro camera found at the accident site contained multiple short videos and still photos of the accident flight. The 8-minute and 42-second video of the accident image sequence showed the airplane maneuvering at a low altitude and high bank angles. The airplane made multiple passes over a clearing in the tree canopy, and the passenger in the right front seat made motions consistent with dropping objects out of the airplane. The airplane continued to maneuver at high bank angles and a low altitude until it hit terrain. Probable cause: the pilot's failure to maintain altitude while maneuvering the airplane at low altitude, which resulted in impact with trees and terrain. From alaskapublic.org, no certificated pilot aboard plane in deadly Alaska crash. According to a preliminary NTSB report issued last week, neither of the two men killed last month in a plane crash in southwestern Alaska had a pilot certificate. Acquaintances of the men said that one of them had recently purchased the wheel-equipped Taylorcraft BC-12D. According to the FAA, neither the pilot/airplane owner nor his passenger possessed a pilot certificate, and neither had an FAA medical certificate or student pilot certificate. Clint Johnson, the NTSB's Alaska chief, said investigators haven't been able to find any signs that either man ever previously held pilot certificates or student pilot certificates. He also said uncertified pilots are rarely seen in Alaska incidents, occurring about just once a year. According to the report, the plane left Port Allsworth around 11:30 a.m. on May 17th and headed for Non-Dalton, about 24 miles away. The partially submerged wreckage was found in a shallow portion of 6 Mile Lake, about 200 yards from the shore. According to witnesses, weather along the route included low clouds, fog, and reduced visibility. And here's something fun from avweb.com. Martin Mars Experience is offered. The owner of the last two flying Martin Mars flying boats is offering a last opportunity for enthusiasts to take the controls of the massive aircraft. Colson Air Tankers is taking reservations for 2 Mars Experiences in the former Navy transports before they go to museums. Neither, unfortunately, involve getting airborne. The water taxi will get customers a walk around and 40 minutes of blasting around Sproat Lake at the company's home base in Port Alberni, British Columbia. The pilot recurrency level puts participants behind the controls of the plane for low and high-speed water taxiing on the lake after a half-day of ground school and a walk around. The 2 planes, the Hawaii Mars and the Philippine Mars, are being returned to flying condition and will be flown to separate museums later this year. The planes were among 4 that were bought by timber companies in the 1950s and converted to water bombers. They were retired from that role in 2011. Colson is now focusing on converting former Southwest Airlines Boeing 737s into air tankers. And here's the first of our 4 stories about pilots being charged with crimes. This comes from globalair.com. Stearman pilot admits to lying to NTSB after 2022 crash and pleads guilty. A pilot admitted to lying to NTSB investigators after his Boeing Stearman biplane crashed into a lake in Oklahoma in August of 2022. The former United Airlines pilot changed his plea to guilty in federal court last week, acknowledging that he lied to investigators to avoid any problems receiving insurance payments. The pilot was indicted on 2 counts of making a false statement and 1 count of obstructing a government proceeding. The 2023 indictment alleged that the pilot made false statements to the NTSB about the cause of the crash. The pilot had told investigators that while maneuvering at about 900 feet above ground, he reduced the engine throttle to 1,000 RPM and began a descent to 500 feet AGL to overfly the lake. The engine then allegedly sputtered and he began to troubleshoot, all the while looking for a place to land. He then realized the engine issue could be carburetor ice. He then reached for the carburetor heat handle, and the plane hit a power line. The plane then crashed into Keystone Lake and was substantially damaged. The passenger, however, said that the plane was running completely fine the entire ride. We then began flying really low, and the pilot said, "This is where I like to do some water dancing." She said he continued to fly over the water and around the curves of the lake while the engine continued operating without issues. While flying level, the passenger noticed that the Stearman was about the altitude of some power lines when the plane hit said power lines and then the water. The NTSB said ADSB data was consistent with the passenger's recollection of the crash. In the final report, the NTSB reported that the cause of the crash was the pilot's failure to maintain clearance from power lines during intentional low-level maneuvering. The passenger, who was 19 at the time, told News 9 about her traumatic flight experience, recalling the scary moments when she was 10 feet underwater fighting for her life. She said she had researched the aviation school website for the ride and initially trusted the pilot to fly her in a small plane for the first time. She said she was not given any safety instructions before takeoff, expecting a 1-hour ride with an experienced pilot, not stuck in a sinking plane as the pilot swam away. She told investigators that the plane was running fine the entire ride. She said that as she noticed the power lines, they were yanked or grabbed and violently thrown down into the water. She said that about 5 seconds after impact, the pilot was out of his seatbelt and pulling her shoulders, yelling for her to take off the seatbelt. She tried removing the seatbelt but was unable as it was too tight for her to squeeze out of the seat. She said the pilot continued yelling for a few more seconds before the plane began to sink under the water with her in it. She told News 9 that once the water got above her chest, the pilot let go and swam away. She continued attempting to unclasp the seatbelt, and after about 20 seconds underwater, she was successful and swam to the surface. In her statement, she said the pilot told her that he had to tell the insurance that it was engine failure or they would not cover it, repeatedly mentioning that it was a $200,000 plane. Another witness confirmed the engine seemed to be running fine before the plane impacted power lines and crashed. The pilot's sentencing date has not been set, but he faces up to 5 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. And from avweb.com, yet another YouTuber faces charges for alleged helicopter stunt. A YouTube personality is facing federal charges after a video he allegedly directed surfaced depicting fireworks being launched from a helicopter at a Lamborghini in a Southern California desert. Authorities say the 24-year-old is being charged with causing the placement of an explosive or incendiary device on an aircraft and if convicted could face 10 years in federal prison. According to AP, prosecutors allege the video titled "Destroying a Lamborghini with Fireworks," posted last July, was filmed without the proper permits or approval from the FAA. Although the video has since been removed, authorities stated that it shows him pressing a fire missiles button while two women on board the helicopter shoot fireworks at the sports car as it speeds across a desert landscape. Officials say he made a court appearance, during which a federal magistrate judge granted his release on a $50,000 bond. From nypost.com, Florida helicopter pilot charged with harassing protected birds after landing on shorebird nesting site. A helicopter pilot in Florida was charged this week by the state's Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, the FWC, after he allegedly landed on a closed shorebird nesting site. He was charged with harassing the nesting birds, a misdemeanor, for allegedly harming the eggs of a protected species when he landed at Egmont Key State Park, scattering hundreds of shorebirds after he smelled fuel, according to Fox 13. He was also cited for landing a helicopter in a state park and entering a closed area. The shorebirds have gathered at the wildlife refuge to breed, according to the FWC. He told Fox 13 he was afraid that fuel was leaking from the copter and he chose to land at the island wildlife refuge instead of risking a crash. Investigators said that witnesses reported seeing a woman get out of the helicopter and take photos at the closed nesting site, which contained black skimmers and sandwich terns. The pilot said he was able to check for a leak without getting out of the helicopter. He added he didn't radio an emergency. The pilot eventually landed south in Punta Gorda. Audubon, Florida said that the wind from the helicopter's blades likely damaged eggs at the nesting site as the pilot landed. He's due back in court on July 1st. And from my local home newspaper, the San Jose Mercury News, for months an Oakland pilot allegedly flew marijuana cross-country on his Cessna. Then the pilot paying for it became a federal informant. An Oakland man has been indicted in Richmond, Virginia, on federal charges he used his 182 to personally fly hundreds of pounds of marijuana across the country over several flights, but the alleged crimes were only discovered after the person suspected of putting him up to it decided to turn him in. The pilot was indicted in late May by a federal grand jury in Virginia on charges of distributing more than 50 kilograms of marijuana. The charge carries a maximum of 20 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. A criminal complaint says that his legal troubles started with an investigation into a person who is now cooperating with the federal government. The unnamed informant is described in court records as someone who was putting on weekly clandestine cannabis sales in Virginia, a state where marijuana possession is legal, but the commercial market is not, and allegedly hired the pilot as a courier. Federal authorities raided the cooperating witness's warehouse last January and found hundreds of pounds of marijuana. That's when he or she decided to turn in the pilot, describing in detail several times in 2023 when he allegedly flew 85 to 120 pounds of marijuana to Virginia on his Cessna and was paid $12,500 to $15,000 per trip. The pilot was arrested in May in the Bay Area and released from jail while the case is pending. Prosecutors have also filed a petition to seize his 1978 Cessna under asset forfeiture laws. And finally from sfgate.com, FAA certification means electric air taxis could start Bay Area flights to SFO in 2025. The FAA approved the certification of Santa Clara-based electric aircraft manufacturer Archer Aviation as an air carrier, which could bring innovative air taxi service to the Bay Area and a few other major cities as early as next year. United Airlines is a strategic investor in Archer and sees the company's piloted four-passenger Midnight aircraft as an efficient way to fly passengers over congested highways into its hub airports. The company said its Part 135 FAA certification allows them to, quote, begin operating aircraft commercially to refine its systems and procedures in advance of launching Midnight into service for airlines like United when it receives Midnight's type certification. The Midnight aircraft has 12 propellers that can rotate to allow vertical takeoff and landings like a helicopter and then rotate for forward flight, giving it the acronym eVTOL. Archer said its goal is to transform urban travel, replacing 60 to 90-minute commutes by car with estimated 10 to 20-minute electric air taxi flights that are sustainable, safe, low noise, and cost-competitive with ground transportation. It has partnered with FBO Atlantic Aviation to establish sites where the eVTOL aircraft can be based initially focused on Northern California, South Florida, Metro Los Angeles, and New York. The bases would provide rapid recharging systems for the aircraft to minimize the time they need to be on the ground between flights. Atlantic and Archer anticipate launch of service across these initial locations in 2025. United and Archer announced last year that the first route for the new eVTOLs will be in Chicago, linking United's O'Hare hub to the existing Vertiport Chicago, providing a 10-minute trip versus an hour or more by car during rush hour. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates, including that recording of an aircraft being intercepted. And then we'll talk with Mark Kolber about the FAA's compliance program. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Hey, before we get to the good news, I wanted to let you know that in a few minutes I'll talk about an engine failure that happened a week ago to a friend of mine. I was monitoring 121.5 at the time and heard her first radio calls during the emergency, so more on that coming right up. Now let's get to the good news. Congratulations to Evan Kelly on his solo. He says, "Thank you, Max. I completed my first solo. It was a day I'll never forget. I don't think any of us forget that first solo. I'm now into the cross-country stage of my training as I prepare for my cross-country solo. Thanks for your G1000 book. I look forward to reading it. Do you have any other books or resources to help better understand the Garmin G5 and the Garmin 650? The aircraft at my flight school are equipped with such avionics." Well, Evan, congratulations. And I think the best way to get familiar with the GTN 650 is to download the GTN Trainer app onto an iPad. It's a free app from Garmin. And there is a lot of commonality between the GTN 650 and the G3000. So my G3000 book covers about half of the screens in the GTN 650. But I'd start with the Trainer app, as you'll learn a lot from that, and it's free. And sorry, I don't know of any good resources on the G5. And I have so much to share with you today. Let's see how much of it we get to. First, I want to tell you about some amazing customer service I received this week. I've told you in the past how I love good design, and I also love great customer service. Now, I've been in LA for the past week, and I have one more week to go to finish USC's Aviation Safety and Certificate program. Great program, and I can recommend it to anyone wanting to learn more about safety. On Monday morning, I got there early as I wanted to get my preferred seat in the classroom. Now, I've mentioned before that my hearing isn't perfect, and I like being in the front row so that I don't miss anything that the instructor says. Now, at each seat in the classroom, there's a yellow tent card, and after people take a seat, they fill in their name on the front and the back of the card so the instructor and the people behind you can see your name. Now, imagine my surprise and delight when I found that there was one card in the room that had already been filled in with my name, and it was at my favorite front and center seat. Now, here's the amazing thing. I was last here 2.5 months ago, and they have classes here every week, so probably they've had a couple hundred students in and out since I was here. And yet, Oscar, who's on the staff, was setting up the room on Friday and said to Tom Anthony, the program director, that Max likes to sit here so he can hear better. Wow. Talk about feeling valued. I mean, it's not part of their job to remember little details like that. And yet, they did. Talk about creating a memory with that one simple act. So thank you, Oscar. Thank you, Tom, and the rest of the team at USC's Aviation program. You really hit it out of the park with that one. And by the way, this concept of creating memories for your customers, that's one I first learned about while visiting Cirrus. Stephen Duker, who's a VP at Cirrus, has always said that their goal for customers buying new airplanes is to create memories. Now, he spent nearly 30 years as a senior executive at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel Company, so he knows a little bit about what he's talking about. Anyway, I'll talk more about my classes here at USC in the coming weeks. Now, by the way, did you notice we had 4 stories this week of pilots being prosecuted? Typically, I find about one of those stories per month, so this is really unusual. And incidentally, one of my instructors this week commented that in some countries outside the U.S., pilots can face criminal prosecution for an accident, but here in the U.S., we traditionally haven't criminalized behaviors related to accidents. But he expressed his concern that that may become more likely here in the U.S. in the future. Now, I have a couple of unusual stories that listeners shared with me this week, and I'll get to those next. But first, let me remind you that this is a listener-supported show. And unfortunately, it's that dreaded first week of the month where we find that a number of your credit cards have expired and you don't find out about it, and we lose you as a supporter forever. Which is why we constantly need to find new supporters each month to help replace the ones we lose. And by the way, if you've signed up in the past to support the show via Patreon and you've never heard from me since, well, there's a problem. Because I always send messages to people that sign up. Now, most likely, you need to go into patreon.com, go to settings, and enable email notifications so you'll be notified when I send you a message or post something new on Patreon, which happens about once a week. And while you're there, just verify that your credit card information is still valid and that it didn't stop charging you maybe a year ago. Or it's possible you've set up email notifications, but that email from Patreon is getting stuck in your spam filter. So check that too if you haven't heard from me in a while. And if you've been listening to the show for a while and you look forward to hearing it each week, well, please support the show. I'm guessing you tip other people when they provide a service, such as in a restaurant or an Uber driver. So yes, Aviation News Talk is a service, just like those other services you support. So please support it now by going to aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you'll see 4 different options for supporting the show. Please sign up to make an ongoing monthly donation, but if you prefer to make a one-time donation, there are options for doing that as well. Now, aviation is a really small, tight community, so see if you know any of these people who've signed up to support the show in the past week. Now, first we have 2 new mega supporters. My thanks to Paul Tierstein and to Brendan Schock, who edited his pledge up to the $50 a month level. And of course, after 2 months, I'll be sending them a signed copy of one of my books. Also, thanks to new Patreon member Pamela Burgess. And thanks to repeat donor Barry Harper, who made a one-time contribution via PayPal. And now let's get to your stories. This first one comes from Patreon supporter Sam Dawson, who sent me the final NTSB report on an accident that occurred in April 2022 in Covington, Georgia. It says, the student pilot, who was the owner of the new multi-engine airplane, a Cessna 340, November 8-4 Golf Romeo, and a private pilot, traveled to Portales, New Mexico, where they met with the former owner of the airplane to finalize the purchase of it. They then flew it back to Georgia the same day, arriving at about 11 p.m. The following day, the student pilot commenced flight training with the private pilot, who offered to provide flight instruction to the student pilot in the student pilot's newly acquired multi-engine airplane, even though he did not possess a flight instructor's rating or a multi-engine airplane rating. Radar data showed that the track of the accident aircraft's route consisted of their departure airport, a midway stop, and the third leg of the flight, where it crashed during the approach to their destination. Witnesses observed a sharp right turn before the airplane's spiraling descent and impact with terrain and unoccupied semi-trailers. Surveillance footage from a parking lot security camera captured the airplane in a right spiral turn just before the accident. A review of the maintenance logbook revealed that the airplane was overdue for its annual inspection. No special flight permit, also called a ferry permit, was obtained from the FAA for its return flight to Georgia. Toxicology testing of the student pilot revealed the presence of amphetamine, a prescription Schedule II controlled substance that may result in cognitive deficits that pose a risk to aviation safety. However, its effect, if any, on the accident could not be determined. It's likely that the private pilot's failure to maintain aircraft control was exacerbated by his lack of a multi-engine airplane rating, his lack of a flight instructor rating, and his poor decision-making. Probable cause, the private pilot's loss of control in flight, which resulted in a collision with terrain. Contributing to the accident was the student pilot's decision to obtain flight instruction from the private pilot and the private pilot's insufficient qualifications to fly or to provide flight instruction in a multi-engine airplane. You should, when you seek out instruction, try to find the most qualified people you can find, especially when transitioning into a new aircraft type. And your friend or your current CFI might not always be the best qualified person you can find. Now, thanks to Kristen Palmez, who sent me photos of an Instagram influencer who talked his way onto the field at Napa Airport in Napa, California, and then proceeded to climb up onto the wing of a Gulfstream G450 and then had someone take photos of him, which he later posted and I'm told are still available online. Apparently, he then got away undetected, and the aircraft subsequently left the airfield, most likely unaware that someone had been climbing on the wing. And apparently that airplane is owned by Ryan Seacrest, who was in town for an event. And all I can say is, please watch your airplanes carefully, and report any illegal behavior like this to authorities. I'd also like to talk briefly about takeoffs. This past week, I've read about 2 accidents where pilots took off in spite of the fact that the engine was not developing full power, and both of these resulted in fatal accidents. One was the crash of a Beach Sierra in October 2022 at the King Delent Hopkins Airport, which killed the 2 people on board. The plane had last flown about 14 months earlier with both men in the cockpit. They had experienced poor takeoff and climb performance during a flight, the NTSB said in its report. In the 2022 flight, witnesses reported that the airplane accelerated on the runway, the engine did not sound normal, and the poor sound continued once it was airborne. An examination of the plane showed improper maintenance of the fuel injector nozzles. The nozzles were missing inserts or restrictors and showed extensive leakage. A mechanic had reported the nozzles had been cleaned as part of the plane's annual inspection. An analysis indicated that as the plane became airborne and immediately before impact, the engine was operating at about 11% less than maximum power and likely significantly less at the start of takeoff. And the report concludes by saying that both pilots should have recognized that the ground run was excessive and aborted the takeoff while still on the runway. And from a separate accident, this comes from the final report of a Holland Travis E Velocity. That's an experimental aircraft that crashed in Andrews, North Carolina in April of 2023. The report says the owner recently purchased the experimental amateur-built modified airplane. He did not have a lot of experience in the make and model, so he hired the accident pilot to conduct the first flight since recent modifications. Witness statements and recorded video showed that during the takeoff roll from the 5,500-foot-long asphalt runway, the airplane accelerated slower than normal, used more runway than normal, and lifted off in a nose-high attitude. The airplane then descended back to the runway and bounced before lifting off nose-high again toward the end of the runway. It climbed about 300 feet above ground level while flying a left traffic pattern back to the runway. Near the crosswind to downwind turn, the engine sounded loud, and the airplane descended into a wooded field and a post-impact fire ensued. Probable cause: the pilot's failure to engage the turbocharger for takeoff and his improper decision to continue the takeoff with partial power rather than to reject the takeoff. And so the key here is, if the engine doesn't sound right, or if it's taking you more runway than usual to get off the ground, abort the takeoff. Don't continue a takeoff where it feels like you have less power than you should. Things are not going to get better in the air, so stay on the ground and then decide what to do next. Now, over 30 years ago, when I lived in New Jersey, I was taking off in a 172 from Hackettstown, New Jersey, and the plane was not developing full RPM. So a friend who was on board, who had more experience than I at the time, said, we should abort the takeoff. And I'm thankful he spoke up, because I had it in my mind that we'd be taking off. We taxi backed, tried it again, and this time we had full power. Why we didn't have it the first time, I don't know. And in hindsight, probably a better choice would have been to call it a day, cancel the flight, and notify maintenance. Back then, I hadn't been taught to do a pre-takeoff briefing. These days, I always do one, and it includes, if there are any issues during the takeoff, and that might be an engine issue or an open door, we'll abort the takeoff. So make sure you do a pre-takeoff briefing for every flight. And here's an interesting story that came to me from Peter Clark of Forward Media, which is a PR firm in New York. On Tuesday night of this past week at Aspen, Colorado, an electronic sign caught fire, which led to the closure of their only runway for 2.5 days. The airport reopened on this past Friday morning. The sign, which was a lit X to let pilots know that the runway was closed, caused significant damage to the old pavement at the south end of the runway. The resulting damage has compromised a 20 by 20 foot section on the runway. The cause of the sign catching fire is unknown. Now, there were 24 flights scheduled from major airlines on Wednesday alone, and they had to turn back. The closest point they could have diverted to was Grand Junction, Colorado. However, Peter pointed out in his email to me that there was one company that was able to quickly adapt to the runway closure, and that's Aero, A-E-R-O, which I believe is a Part 135 company. Peter said in his email that this semi-private airline showed exceptional ability to adapt in response to the recent closure at Aspen Airport. He said their business model uniquely allows it to pivot swiftly and fly to private airports ensuring that the public continues to receive essential air services. In this instance, Aero adjusted its operations to offer flights between Rifle, that's KRIL, just a 1-hour drive from Aspen, and from LA's Van Nuys Airport. This capability to utilize private airports during unforeseen events sets Aero apart in the aviation industry. Interesting story about the runway closure. So, Peter, thanks so much for sending that along and telling us about Aero. Now, a few weeks ago, the president visited the San Francisco Bay Area for a couple of days, and the skies were very quiet because of the TFR in place. I was departing from Oakland on a Vision Jet flight to Las Vegas, and we noticed that there was very little activity at the airport because that 10-mile inner core of the TFR came right up to the end of one of the runways, and I think that scared people away. But it seemed to the pilot and me that we could take off on runway 10 left or right with a tailwind and fly away from the TFR rather than into it. So I picked up the phone and called NorCal Approach and asked if that would be viable, and they said, yes, indeed, we could do that. So we took off from 10 right and found that we were pointed right at Las Vegas, which probably saves 7 or 8 minutes versus the normal departure, which initially takes us in the wrong direction as we make a large circle over San Francisco to eventually get headed back southeast toward Vegas. Now, after we took off, it was again very quiet as there were a few planes flying. Now, we were monitoring 121.5 as we're required to, and about 11:10 a.m., we heard a fighter jet calling a hapless pilot who was apparently unaware of the TFR. And we heard the fighter call 3 times with no response. And so by the second time he called, I was all set up to record. I know I started the recording a little late and missed the first word or two, but here's what it sounded like.
0 miles northeast of San Fran. This is the United States Air Force Armed Air Defense Fighter on VHF guard. You have been intercepted. If you hear this transmission, acknowledge with a radio call, rock your wing, and contact ATC. Snap heading northeast.
That's something you don't want to hear when they're calling you. Now, I recorded today's interview with Mark Kolber before this incident occurred, but I think I did coincidentally ask him about interceptions and how the FAA deals with those. So in a few minutes, check out what he said about that. And by the way, that's not the only thing I recently heard on 121.5. A week ago, I was on another Vision Jet trip, this time coming back from Las Vegas to Oakland. And when I was about 150 miles out over the Sierra Nevadas, I heard something I've never heard for real before, something you hope you never hear or never say. And those were the words, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Let me tell you, that gets your attention and leaves a queasy feeling in your gut. But worse, it was a call sign I knew and a voice I thought I recognized. After she said, Mayday, 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 the pilot said, this is 739 Tango Whiskey. We're 9 miles east of Livermore and we've had an engine failure. We're going to land at Meadowlark, which, by the way, is a tiny private field about 6 miles east of Livermore. Now, I've flown that particular plane many times. It's a Cessna 172 that's on the line at the West Valley Flying Club where I teach, and the voice sounded like CFI and friend Kelly O'Day. So I was pretty worried. A SkyWest pilot was the first to respond, and then 1 or 2 other pilots jumped in, one reminding her to fly best glide speed. I believe that she said she might try for the Livermore airport, and then she was gone. All of those transmissions happened within perhaps 20 seconds, and then NorCal came onto the frequency, but she didn't respond. At the time, we were with Oakland Center, and I was guessing they didn't know anything about the emergency, so I was in a little bit of anguish for about 20 minutes until we switched to NorCal. And after the pilot called in, I called and asked if they had time for a question. And I told them I had heard the Mayday call and that I was concerned as it was a club plane, and could they tell me if the plane had landed safely. They told me it had, and that was a huge relief. And then a few minutes later, they called me back and asked if I knew the pilot personally. And I said, yes, I think I recognized her voice. And they said, please tell her that they couldn't believe how calm she was when she called in. I then asked where she landed, and they said runway 25 right at Livermore. So then I was able to relax, but I knew the first call I'd be making after I landed. After we landed, I texted Kelly and told her I had just landed at Oakland and that I had my car and did she need a ride home from Livermore. She texted back that she was already in an Uber, and the first thing she asked was, did I sound nervous? I texted back that I was putting the jet away and that I'd phone her shortly. And then we talked through the whole situation. She told me that a few weeks before she'd been in the plane doing a run-up, and that when they did the idle check, the engine quit. So they took the plane back to maintenance, where subsequently she believes they made some adjustment to the engine. On the day of the incident, she said for the idle check, they reduced the RPM back to about 500 RPM, but didn't pull back hard on the throttle to see if they could make it quit. They then went to fly some maneuvers. She said they did 3 power-off stalls, but on the third one, when they pulled the engine to idle, the engine quit and she could not get it restarted. From FlightAware, I can see that she was around 4,300 feet when the engine quit, and for reference, Livermore Airport is at 400 feet MSL. She said that her training kicked in and she immediately went to best glide speed and then started running through the steps to restart the engine, but that she could not get it restarted. She initially turned toward Meadowlark Airport, which is a private field with a tiny runway. It's just 1,860 feet long. But she did eventually get the engine started, and so she decided to continue the extra 5 to 6 miles to get to Livermore. Now, she questioned that decision when we talked, and I told her that under the circumstances I would probably have done the same thing, but only because she was fairly confident about the cause of the engine problem and that it was unlikely to reoccur, provided she didn't pull the throttle to idle again. Now, if I had no idea what caused the engine problem and I was in that 172, I would have been more inclined to land at Meadowlark, since I never want to count on an engine to continue running when it's running rough. Now, Kelly did a couple of other smart things. She canceled her next lesson and took off for the rest of the day, which makes a lot of sense when you've either experienced or witnessed an incident or an accident. And later, she told me that she took off the following day as well, as she said, to process her thoughts and emotions about the event. And by the way, her student that day was a teenage boy taking his second flight lesson. Now, she taught his brother to fly, and it was time for the younger brother to take flight lessons. His mother said, "You have to do your flight lessons with Kelly because she's the only one I trust." And when Kelly asked the student after the event how he felt, he told her that he was relatively calm, as he knew that she would take care of him and keep him safe. And that, my friends, tells you much of what you need to know about the special relationships that we as flight instructors develop with some of our clients. It's about trust. And to earn that trust, we as CFIs need to stay at the top of our game every day, because people are depending upon us. And there's no room to be just average as a flight instructor. You need to bring passion and commitment to the job, because sometimes the unexpected happens. And when it does, you need to have done the preparation and the work ahead of time so that you'll know how to respond. So Kelly, great job, and thanks for letting me share your story. Coming up next, our conversation with Mark Kolber on the FAA's compliance program, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let me tell you a little about Mark Kolber. He's an aviation attorney and a flight instructor based in North Carolina. He's a frequent contributor to IFR Magazine and PilotWorkshops.com. And now here's our conversation with Mark Kolber. Well, Mark, welcome back to the show. So great to have you back here again.
Good to be here again.
So I read something really interesting that you had written, and I just want to find out how it is that you came to write this. It said, Mark Kolber is a CFI, II, and aviation lawyer who insists the best results come from when the FSDO doesn't even know he is involved. Tell us about that.
Sometimes people are put off by lawyers being involved in things. And what I have found through the years, and especially since we're talking about the compliance program, especially since the compliance program, is that very often the best thing to do with a client who can actually handle themselves is to give them advice of how to do things, how to respond, what to say, rather than to be, the mouthpiece who comes in and starts yelling at some ASI who's really just doing their job. And one of the things that I do when I get a consultation about one of these is I'm making a judgment right up front. Is this something where I actually have to be involved because it's really serious? Or is this something that is very likely to end with something other than formal enforcement?
Oh, good. Okay. Thanks for explaining that. Well, before we dive into the compliance program, just give us a little bit of history. What did we have before the compliance program and what's different?
Well, we still have everything we had before the compliance program, but we have something new with the compliance program. And actually, the compliance program started in 2015, so it's not all that new anymore. It's been around for a while, and it's been overall fairly successful. But essentially, you have a flow of what happens when there's an FAA investigation. It starts in many different ways. It may start with the most common one is a pilot deviation. You're assigned an altitude and you don't do the altitude. You infringe on a Class Bravo without a Class Bravo clearance. And that's how these things get started. And then they go to an investigation stage. And it's always been kind of a system where certain things are handled at the FSDO level and certain things get kicked upstairs. So at the FSDO level, you had these things called warning notices, where you basically get an informal warning. It would stay on your record for 2 years and then go away. You had those kinds of things. And then if it was something more serious, it would be bumped up to the FAA legal department, at which point you would get a letter of investigation, where I love the language of it. It says, we offer to suspend your pilot certificate, as if they're doing you a favor. And so you get to that. And at that point, you are dealing with something roughly akin to a lower level criminal case. You have the FAA adding as a prosecutor and a charging entity. If you have an opportunity to plea bargain with the FAA at an informal conference. From there, if you can't agree on something and you want to challenge it, you file with the NTSB. And the NTSB we think of in terms of accident investigations, but it also acts as the trial and appellate court for the FAA. And so you go in front of an administrative law judge and you have a trial with evidence and witnesses being presented. They make them a decision. If you don't like the decision or the FAA doesn't like the decision, it goes up to the full NTSB, which acts as an appellate court. Still, if you don't like what's going on, you go up and you go into the real court system. You go into the Court of Appeals or the federal district courts. So that's really the essential flow of what's going on. So you had administrative penalties, which were the warning letters and things like that. And then you had enforcement, where you're talking about suspensions, you're talking about revocation of certificates.
And so with the compliance philosophy or compliance program that we have now, the difference is what, fairly subtle, or is it a fairly large change?
It started out fairly subtle, but it actually became a large change. The idea was in 2015, the FAA came up with this compliance, originally called the compliance philosophy, where they're saying that, the best way to handle pilot deviations isn't with a hammer. It's with retraining. It's with discussion. And so they kind of moved into that area. And in the compliance philosophy in 2015 and the rewrite of it in 2018, the idea was to bring everybody on board. And overall, we talk about it in some detail, but overall, it's been successful. One of the downsides is it took a lot of things off the desk of the FAA legal department. So the things that they do go after, they really go after because they have the resources to do it rather than have to spend it on things that really don't think are quite as important.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it sounds like really the FAA has been adopting the safety culture that has been part of most safety programs in aviation for a long time, which is a philosophy of non-punitive, open, acknowledging the fact that all pilots make mistakes, but if we just work with them to help improve performance, that pilots are going to be more forthcoming about the errors that they've had, and overall that's going to result in a safer system. Is that a good way to characterize it?
That's a very good way to characterize it. And in fact, the language that they used when they first came out with it is they said, and I'm quoting now from the original compliance program documentation, some deviations arise from factors such as flawed procedures, simple mistakes, lack of understanding, or diminished skills. Deviations of this nature can most effectively be corrected through root cause analysis and training. And so what they've done is they've created a two-way street where they're hoping for a more open dialogue, where we don't tell pilots, just zip it up, don't say anything, wait till they come after you. It becomes more of a dialogue. And it's been surprisingly successful. I can give you one example. I was actually on a non-aviation job at a conference, and I get a call from a pilot. This was 2016, so the program is really new. It's only been there for a year. 2016, and he's doing touch and goes at a non-towered airport. And the FBO comes on the radio and says, "I think you need to land. The FAA is on the phone and they want to talk to you." And it turns out this is 2016, so it's the presidential election period. There is a presidential TFR in the area, a campaign TFR that covers the airport. So he goes over to some people, some of his friends, and one says, "Oh, you are so screwed," and somebody else says, "Call Mark." So he called me, and here's what we did. I sat down with him and I said, "Who is your instructor?" And he told me his instructor. And I said, "You go to your instructor and you sit down and go over with them and log this as ground, the importance of getting a pre-flight briefing, the weather and everything like that, even if you're just doing touch and goes at your home airport pattern." Well, he did that. By the time the FAA inspector got to him, he handed the FAA inspector the logbook. That was the end of the entire process. There was no repercussions. Nothing happened, despite this being, one of the big deals at TFR. And that kind of shows you the kind of things that they've been doing. And it's also, by the way, been my number one advice, is that you be proactive about getting the training that is related to what was going on. And I tons of examples of that.
And that fits exactly with what's been going on with our local flying club, and why I tell everyone, contact our safety office. Don't try and hide this. Don't try and cover this up. They will ask somebody to go out and do some remedial work. And usually then when the safety inspector calls 10 days later, he's happy that we've already known about the problem. We've already remediated it. And it ends right there. What the club really hates is when they get a call and they have no idea that whatever this event actually happened. So yeah, I agree. Being forthright and forthcoming really makes a lot of sense these days.
And I think that's something that had been in progress before the compliance philosophy became something formal. It was happening around the country anyway. And I think part of the setup of the program was to bring everybody in, because there are always going to be the cowboys who just want to go after you and all that. And so now you make it into a national program. And this is also what's going on about this time, is the consolidation of FSDOs, where they're going a little bit more vertical and a little bit less horizontal. So they're really just kind of bringing everybody into the fold and saying, this is not only a good idea on a case-by-case basis, but this is a good idea overall as a general policy for the FAA.
Well, let's walk through the process from the beginning. Let's suppose that I've had an event of some kind. Perhaps I violated an FAR. Tell us about the most common events that pull people into the program, and how can these investigations get kicked off and started? It's not just ATC telling me I need to call a phone number, I guess.
Well, a lot of times it is ATC having you go to the phone number. It depends on the deviation. The most common in-flight deviation is an altitude bust. And that's for both IFR and VFR pilots, but it's a big deal. It's an IFR one. You put the wrong number in your selected altitude and you blow right through it, and it happens. But this, for whatever reason, altitude rather than heading, the vertical deviation seems to be the most common. And that's the one where you get what's called the Brasher warning. Like the Miranda warning in the criminal area, the Brasher warning is named after somebody named Brasher, where they didn't give the warning. And the NTSB ended up saying it was required because the pilot has a right to know what you're complaining about in a timely manner, so they can, get their own ducks in a row and not hear something 5 months later and go, I don't know what to do with this. So you had that kind of going on. You also have complaints that come in from people. So, for example, a mechanic, you don't think of it in terms of a mechanic situation, but the FAA might get a complaint about a mechanic and the job he did and start an investigation there. In the 135, or actually the gray charter world, they say the most common complaints about Part 135 violations are from Part 135 operators who are saying, these guys are being unfair to us. We've gone through the hoops. We're spending all the money. We're doing the extra procedures, and these guys are just, bringing people around. So the process can start from a number of areas. There's also a hotline that the FAA has where, anybody can just file a complaint against anybody else. And unfortunately, that's one of those things that we hear stories about real serious abuse where during the nasty divorce, one party calls the FAA to report their soon-to-be ex-spouse. So it can start in any number of ways.
Now, are there some things that are just so egregious that they wouldn't fall into the program, or maybe the opposite, some things that are so trivial that they wouldn't fall into the program?
Well, I think trivial is not going to be a big issue. Is that it's there and there are very few things where they're just not going to investigate at all. But there are some. I've seen situations where we prepared for an investigation and it never happened. They just just let it go. Nobody cared. So there are things like that. Egregious, yeah. There are things that are not amenable to a compliance program. One is a non-compliant pilot, somebody who basically blows off the system, doesn't respond at all, shows that they really don't care. There are the ones that arguably are, the FAA trying to make a point about something. So they kind of go after somebody for that. But really the ones that you really see that they don't do with the compliance program is anything that involves a fraud or misrepresentation. If you have a pilot who has lied on their medical application, that's not going to be in the compliance program. And now we're talking about the FAA finding out first. You're not disclosing ahead of time. And from the FAA standpoint, the saying is there's no such thing as an innocent mistake when you're disclosing on a medical certificate. You're going to have to show them that it was an innocent mistake. But, those kinds of things involving fraud, logbook falsification, application falsification, those are the kinds of things that are not amenable. The repeat offender is obviously, well, we've done this 2 or 3 times with you already, and you still do this, do that, and the other thing. Things that are clearly intentional. If you're buzzing a schoolyard, it's hard to say, well, this was just an accidental buzzing. It's that kind of a thing that are going to, the kind of things that you and I would look at and say, this guy's being a jerk.
Right.
and so we're not going to just do something simple with them.
Okay. So suppose I've gotten that phone call. What would you recommend that I do next, or where do we go from there?
Well, it's interesting. The way the FAA contacts you. So, well, first, let's take the Brasher warning. You've got the thing, you've gotten the phone number. And, usually this happened to Harrison Ford. Everybody remembers that one and that it was handled under the compliance program. And one of the things that they had in terms of all the stuff on YouTube and all the audio stuff was listening to him on his call after he's told to call the tower. And it's phone call to the tower. And you can hear this back and forth where he's really upset at what happened. And the tower controller is like, all I really need is your name and how to contact you and your pilot certificate number. You don't really have to tell me anything else. And, that's really the way that call can work. It's make the call, listen more than talk. All they want is from you is name, rank, and serial number. That's all they care about. The last thing a controller wants to be is a cop. They don't really want to know. So you take care of that. The next step is going to be some kind of contact from the FAA. In the pre-compliance program days, it was almost always a letter of investigation. Do it very formally from the beginning. With the compliance program, what's really developed, especially is it may be a letter and it may be a phone call. It might be an email. You might get a text message. And my advice is that if something comes to you, if your phone rings and you see on the screen that it's the FAA, don't answer it. It's not that you are trying to hide from them. It's that you want to hear what they say so you can think about what, if anything, you're going to say in response. And just to back up for a moment, don't forget that NASA form. Okay. That lovely NASA form that says that what we call the get out of jail free card, it's not really a get out of jail free card, but it's part of the process that you really should do, because if it goes to formal enforcement, it gives you some defenses down the line. But getting back to your question, so you get this phone call, you get this text message, and it becomes a back and forth. And what I say, and I've done this presentation to pilot groups, and I've done a presentation with legal groups, this is the point where you do want some kind of advice. It doesn't mean, you want to, lawyer up and all that kind of thing, but you want professional advice. What is the best way to handle it? And that's where you want to. So that's going to be the next step in the process, that contact and that back and forth.
Okay, good. So I've decided to give you a call, Mark, and then I imagine that where things go from here could follow many, many different paths and different routes. Do you want to take, for example, a particular example? You mentioned a pilot in a restricted area in California. Is that a good way to kind of talk through some of the things that may happen?
That actually is. And the interesting thing about that situation is that this is pre-compliance program. This is one of the ones I see as an example that this was something going on that the FAA finally formalized. It was a pilot who filed IFR, was in an IFR flight plan, and we still don't know for sure where the mistake happened, but he winds up heading right into a restricted area. Fortunately, we had an air traffic controller who knew what was going on, and it was before he even got into the restricted area. It was one of those, where are you going? That's not your clearance. And so they take care of it. And what happens is under the old program, the pilot gets a letter of investigation from the FAA about the pilot deviation from their clearance. Basic kind of situation. The pilot calls a lawyer, and the lawyer's first advice is under the pilot's Bill of Rights. The lawyer actually gets involved in this one. It doesn't sort of stay in the background, gets involved, sends a letter to the aviation safety investigator in which he says, we want the ATC tapes. We want the data that we're entitled to under the pilot's Bill of Rights. The ASI writes back and says, I've put in the order for it. In the meantime, would you send me the pages from your client's logbook that show that they just basic currency information? The lawyer reviews the logbook, and lo and behold, the pilot is not IFR current. Okay, so now this is getting more serious. So you know the pilot is not current and has an IFR deviation. And the funny part of the story, the lawyer goes back to the ASI and says, hypothetically speaking, what if the pilot wasn't current? Now, that's lawyer jargon that the rest of the world knows means, my client's guilty, but I can't admit it formally. And the ASI says, well, kind of see what's going on. What came out of it was a warning letter, which is essentially saying, you made a mistake. Don't do it again. This will be on your record for 2 years, and then it'll go away. That is quite the light handling of something for something which, restricted airspace violation and lack of currency. It's just amazing. So this is a process that was going on.
So what are some of the different outcomes that can occur? Where can people end up in the compliance program today?
Just about any kind of pilot deviation can get you into that, with the exceptions of the ones I mentioned before, the very serious ones. The typical compliance program, if you're in the compliance program, one of the things they can do is they can require recurrent training for you. And if they do it, then it's something you may have to pay for. There was actually one case involving a mechanic where they had to go through this recurrent training with somebody. And it happens all the time. But one of the things that you can do is this thing of being proactive about it. You know that the best bet of dealing with the FAA on one of these compliance program directed situations is to take the bull by the horns and take care of it yourself. We talked about that earlier. That is just a great way to do it. Get the training that covers that area so that once you're dealing with the FAA, you have something to show them that you have the right attitude. You are treating it seriously. And if they do that, one thing they may do is say, okay, we're fine, we're done. There's a lot of them where they're not even using the compliance action, quote unquote, in a formal way. It's just going away. And so that's your best case scenario, is it just goes away. The worst case scenario is nobody's happy and it goes to the next step. And, that's kind of the downside, in that you've basically admitted everything by that point. But, the fortunate thing about the program is that, it has worked surprisingly well, which means that it's doing something for the FAA and not just for the pilots.
Hmm. I remember years ago hearing someone say that when they tell you to call, don't call, because then the FAA is going to be able to actually do what they don't have prior to that, which is tie the name of an airman to the particular aircraft that created the violation. Now, I always had mixed feelings about that advice. What are your thoughts on it?
I think there was a case where that happened, where there was nothing tying the pilot to the incident other than the pilot's admission that they were there. But that is so few and far between. And that, of course, was before ADS-B, where they're just tracking you. If they want to, if it's not serious, why go through all that? If it is serious, they're going to find you. What happened to Martha Lunkin? Okay, that was, the ADS-B was suddenly off. The transponder was off. They didn't have any trouble finding her. I have a friend who's since passed away, who was an aviation lawyer, and he tells a story about one of his clients years and years ago who busts Class Bravo airspace. And so what he does is he turns off his transponder and he hightails it, doesn't go back to his home base, goes someplace else entirely, lands, and walks into the FBO where the guy behind the desk says, "Oh, the FAA is looking for you." So they can find you. If they want to find you, they will find you. And so I always thought that was kind of funky advice. I might, if somebody called me and gave me a whole situation, there probably would be situations in which I would say, your best bet is to say nothing and just wait until you hear anything from them. So it's one of those case specific situations. But I agree with you, Max. For the most part, the situations in which just, stonewalling it out is going to be a benefit are way outweighed by the situations in which it's not going to help at all.
Yeah, and so I'm guessing that in those kinds of situations, if a pilot doesn't make the call, that's just going to really tick off the inspector and perhaps make them more dogged about pursuing the violation.
Well, not making the call, in terms of the Brasher warning of call the tower, not calling is not really going to do much one way or the other. You're not required to make that call. And sometimes there are going to be situations where you probably shouldn't. Usually it's really if you can maintain the attitude that I'm calling to give name, rank, and serial number and just listen to what they have to say, then you're not going to make a lot of admissions. And then you're still going to be, and sometimes I'll have somebody who has had a Brasher and says, should I call the FAA and talk to them? And the answer is no. Maybe they won't even, maybe they'll never call. Maybe it'll be one of those that they go, this isn't really worth our time to even talk about. So being proactive doesn't mean calling the cops on yourself. It means, responding to what's there, being careful about what you say, and, waiting until they say something and they ask you for something.
Okay, so we've talked about a couple different possible outcomes. One is nothing happens. One is you get a warning notice that gets expunged within 2 years. I guess there are probably some other outcomes. One that comes to mind would be the 709 ride. Tell us about that and any of the other outcomes we haven't discussed.
Well, we've gone through the process in terms of, things like suspensions and revocations. The 709 ride is an interesting hybrid. I think most people who have had a 709 ride come out of it saying, or those who haven't had the ride but have had the request for one, kind of treat it as some kind of punishment. The FAA doesn't see it as punishment. The 709 ride is the basic right of the FAA to check your credentials and check your capabilities. The only requirement for the FAA to request a 709 ride is that it's a reasonable request. I don't think there's ever been a case where the NTSB has said the request is not reasonable. 709 rides tend to be very, very targeted. You land gear up. Okay. Have you violated anything? Well, not really, except, I guess the limitations for the airplane require the gear to be down when you land, but you really haven't violated anything, but your ability to do so has come into question. And so you're going to have a 709 ride that is going to be simply show you can land with the gear. There was a situation with an instructor who was doing a demo flight with somebody and didn't check the fuel tanks and wound up running out of fuel. I mean, talk about something insane. And wound up, no violation, but a 709 ride as an instructor. The entire 709 ride was show me how to do a pre-flight inspection. That was it. That was the 709 ride. So 709 rides can be a real headache depending on what the situation is, but usually they're just targeted, and they're supposed to be targeted. And what's really kind of nice, if you think that the local FSDO has it in for you on a 709 ride, you could ask to do it with another FSDO. You can move this thing around, and that doesn't usually happen because you think somebody's got it in for you. Usually it's because your deviation happened in a remote area where you don't live, and so you ask them to transfer it to you. It can be used as a club, though.
Then how so?
Well, it can be used as it can be used as a club. I mean, we still have the cowboy inspector floating around, somebody who just really wants to get you. And using the compliance program, they don't want to use the compliance program. But the problem is that they kick it upstairs to FAA legal. The FAA legal department will kick it right back to them and say, this is a compliance program item. So what do? They use a 709 ride as more of a stick rather than a carrot. I actually had one where they decided to 709 somebody in a situation which I thought was unfair. And the problem is, if it actually goes up to the NTSB, we would lose on that. But I said this is unfair. And what I did is I said, okay, we're asking it to be done by another FSDO, which opened up a dialogue, which the case wound up being handled under the compliance program. And I guess that's another example where the involvement of a lawyer can really help. Who knows what they're doing anyway?
So I guess another possible outcome is people could be required to get remedial training. I've had 2 cases where people have come to me with letters from the FAA that says, you must find a flight instructor and you must do all of the things on this 2-page letter, which included, in one case, many ground items, many flight items, and so on. Tell us about that process, how people end up with that outcome.
Well, before the compliance program, that was the result in either of warning letter or correction notice. Here's what you have to do to fix what you're doing. That is actually something that exists under the compliance program. We talked about being proactive and then just going away, which is wonderful, but sometimes that doesn't happen. And one of the things that they can do under the compliance program is they can insist that you get some kind of remedial training, and they could set it up very formally. And really, it's another reason that if you're faced with a pilot deviation as the pilot, that you do something proactively, because it can forestall that. Go pick an instructor, go do this. And sometimes they pick the instructor for you to do the program with, and which means you're probably going to pay a high price financially and otherwise in that situation. But that is one of the things that the program is designed to do, is to replace punishment with retraining. And if the pilot doesn't arrange them themselves, or does it in a way that the investigating ASI isn't satisfied with, then the FAA is going to come up with their own program. And it's typically done within a 21-day turnaround, and just, get this done. And the whole idea from the ASI standpoint is get it off my desk. One of the things people don't think about, they always think about ASIs like hiding in the bushes, waiting for you to have some violations so they could jump out at you. But most ASIs are working on things. They're working on airworthiness. They're working on mechanical issues. They're the POI for a Part 135 operator. Investigating pilot deviations is actually extra work. It's not, it's obviously in their job description, but they're extra things. And the last thing that any of us want is extra work we didn't ask for. And so, one of these things are the idea from the pilot standpoint is help the ASI get this off their desk. And that's really what, when they finally get to down and say, here's the 21-step program that you need to follow in order to maintain your pilot certificate. It means you've been compliant, you've followed the rules, you've done what they want you to do, but you've left it to them to come up with a solution rather than offering one on your own. And of course, if you fail the compliance program, it's going to go to an enforcement action. That's another time that it goes to the next step.
Got it. And so the next step is where it starts to become expensive and more complex and takes a lot more time. And I'm guessing none of us really want to fall into that part of the process.
No, because, one of the things that the compliance program does by getting things off somebody's desk is it means if it's something they want to take seriously, they now have the manpower and the resources that aren't being stretched as thin as they were otherwise.
Well, Mark, as we start to wrap up here, any final thoughts on things we haven't talked about or advice you have for pilots to either avoid getting involved in the system or what to do if they do become involved?
Well, the way to not get involved in the system is to not only be current, but be proficient. That not having a pilot deviation is the way to avoid getting into the process of pilot deviations. Keep up. If you're an instrument pilot, keep up those instrument skills. Hand fly once in a while so that you remember that, when the next fix comes, I have to turn and I got to descend, and you're not just leaving it to the autopilot. Maintain your level of proficiency. Get yourself involved in groups. We have IFR and VFR groups that are meeting monthly to discuss issues, discuss things that happen. Whether it be, your aviation magazines, keep up to date, keep your head in the game, even if you're not flying as often. Those kinds of things do that. The FAA is a big seller of the Wings program. And, what's nice about the Wings program is that the history of it, as messy as it is and as sometimes difficult to navigate as it is, one of the things is that there are statistically less pilot deviations among people who are Wings program people. So do those seminars. Listen to your podcast. Listen to Opposing Bases for that matter, so you know what's going on in the ATC world. There are even, there are social media groups where pilots are discussing. Get involved in those. You learn things by participating.
Yeah. Keep your head in the game. Great advice.
Absolutely.
So, Mark, where do people find more of your work or get in contact with you if they need some help?
Well, they can find me most anywhere. I've been involved in online aviation groups since the 90s. And so I'm easy to get a hold of. In terms of my material, I've been a regular contributor to IFR magazine since 2017. Actually, the most recent Flying magazine has the second article I ever did for IFR. Apparently, because they purchased up a number of the Belvoir publications, and they're doing it. And it was somebody else who told me, "Hey, guess what? You have an article in Flying." And I go, "Wait a minute, I don't write for Flying," and so it was there. So I'm involved in social media groups. I've been writing. I'm with the Pilot Workshops group, which does online scenario-based training, very oral, and do that. And so I'm you throw my name out there, and you might find the other Mark Kolber, who's a lawyer in Manhattan, but most likely you'll find me.
Okay, Mark, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Enjoyed it. Anytime, Max.
Yeah, my thanks to Mark for joining us here today. You can read more of his work in IFR Magazine and at pilotworkshops.com. And you can support the show when you buy a Lightspeed headset. Now, I've been using only Lightspeed headsets for over 25 years. I currently have 4 of their different models, which I use in different airplanes and helicopters. 2 of my favorite things about Lightspeed are their trade-up program and their support. The trade-up program lets you trade in an older Lightspeed headset for a new model, and they'll give you hundreds of dollars of credit for your old headset. I've used that program at least 3 or 4 times over the years to trade up to newer models, and I love it because it preserves my investment that I made in the original headset. And their support is great. They've never charged me a penny for fixing any of my headsets, and their turnaround time is relatively short, which is important to me as I often fly 5 days a week. When you buy a new headset from Lightspeed, they will send a donation to the show, but only if you use one of the links in our show notes first to get to their website. To find those links, just go out on the web and type in aviationnewstalk.com/Lightspeed. By the way, my favorite model is the Lightspeed Delta Zulu because I have some hearing loss, and the Delta Zulu has a built-in frequency equalizer that you can custom tune to your ears to compensate for any hearing loss. It took me only just a few minutes to set that up, and I find that it makes it a little easier for me to understand ATC transmissions. Again, check out all of their models by going to aviationnewstalk.com/Lightspeed. Thanks so much. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. But probably the best way you can support the show is by telling all of your friends about Aviation News Talk. And if they're not familiar with how to listen to a podcast, and probably half the population doesn't know how to do it, show them how they can subscribe to the show for free on their smartphone. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up, and remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around if it don't look right coming down. Don't wait until your side's baby sliding upside down. You can always